Money Radio, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure now to welcome Betsy Southerland. Betsy Southerland has been the Director of Science and Technology in the Office of Water and has worked in environmental protection for about 40 years or so. Betsy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
You are and I should mention the Office of Water is part of EPA, I believe?
Yes.
And you are no longer in that role, is that correct?
I retired in August of 2017.
And you retired with a farewell letter.
Yes, my farewell letter was pretty much a warning to the public in our country that they were going to lose an enormous amount of public health and safety protections. And it turned out I was not exaggerating at all. I can tell you after observing the actions of the Trump EPA over the past 2 years, we have lost an enormous amount of public health and safety protections.
Give us some idea of what we have lost in this deregulation, because the opposite side of the argument is, yeah, but we've made business much more efficient by eliminating some of these unnecessary regulations that are such a burden on business.
So let's talk about that. There have been nearly 80 environmental regulations blocked, delayed, or targeted for repeal by the Trump administration. That's, as of December of 2018. Every one of those repeals means that new controls on pollutants like mercury, arsenic, lead, highly toxic chemicals are not going in place. And in fact, now the public downstream and downwind of this water and air pollution will either have to live with the adverse health effects from this increased pollution, or they'll have to find a way to control it themselves, put filters on their own drinking water, or do something through baby state taxes and state regulations to try to clean the air again. So what we've done is we have transferred the costs for dealing with pollution from the polluters who cause that health effect to the people who have to live with those health effects.
And we've seen with some of the recent caps on state and local taxes, the salt taxes, if local communities do want to clean it up, there are limits to what they can reasonably expect because of the tax deductibility of any taxes that might be imposed for cleanup.
Absolutely. And I think it's heartbreaking because every environmental statute that has been passed by Congress is based on the principle that the polluter should pay for cleaning up the pollution he causes, not the citizens who happen to live downstream or downwind of that pollution.
Well, that just seems to make a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, and it makes good economic sense, too. We know from years and years of study that treating pollutants at the source when they're first generated is orders of magnitude less expensive than having to treat it once it's been dispersed into the environment and covered huge air sheds, whole water bodies, and in some cases, actually acres and acres of land where there's been improper disposal of pollutants and hazardous waste.
Sure, I think we all understand the idea that if you can nip it in the bud, it's better than if it's allowed to just get worse and worse and worse.
Absolutely.
But that brings us to another point, and that is that we are looking at major climate change, and we're getting closer and closer to the point of no return. Some folks say it could be coming in the next dozen years or so. And if that's what we are looking at, a major event like climate change tipping point, it doesn't sound like the EPA is particularly well prepared for this.
It's absolutely the opposite. EPA is doing everything right now to speed that crisis along. They have repealed or are in the process of repealing many of the protections that were put in place in the previous administration to at least slow the pace of climate change. So they are right now doing everything their donors, and many of their political donors are oil and gas representatives, repealing every possible rule that would have made such great progress in controlling not only greenhouse gases, but toxic air pollutants also.
What would it take for the EPA to kind of change course at this point and start focusing on climate change issues and really be able to do it effectively?
It could be done, but this is absolutely going to be an impossibility under the current political leadership. Right now, everything that the EPA does is at the request of their political donors. And their political donors are ones who want deregulation without any protection for public health, and certainly for no slowing of the climate change crisis that's coming in the next couple of decades.
Now, I understand businesses are looking for deregulation. That's what they want. It changes their profitability, and at least on a short-term basis, and they're willing to take that trade. But regular citizens have a voice in this as well. Why are they not being heard at EPA?
Well, it's really interesting. Not only is the private citizen and public interest groups not being heard at EPA, but actually many of the repeals that EPA is undertaking are at the request of only one or two companies who were their political donors within an industry sector. And actually, the rest of the industry sector is not happy with some of these repeals. That's how extreme this deregulation is. And I can give you a couple examples of that if you're interested.
Yeah, I can think of one, and I think it has to do with the one that came to my mind was the elimination of the CAFE fuel standards for automobiles.
Absolutely. Honda and Ford disavowed that. And in fact, most of the automakers in this country oppose freezing those car fuel efficiency rules at the 2020 levels. They wanted some flexibility, but not a complete freeze. Marathon Oil Refinery, however, and Koch Industries, who sell gasoline, they're the ones who got this administration to move forward with that 2020 freeze on car efficiency.
Betsy, I first tried to reach out to you when the government shutdown was going on, and I'm pretty sure that affected EPA and probably the Office of Water, probably considered as non-essential employees. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's got to be a little bit of a slap, being called a non-essential employee. What is morale like following the shutdown, and is it permanent damage?
Well, I think the permanent damage that's being done is really not hiring the people that they need to implement Congress's laws. That's the big damage that's being done. So right now, the agency staffing level is way below where it's been for decades. We're down to less than 14,000 employees in all of EPA. That's a level that's much smaller than it was before a number of our major statutes were passed, like amendments to the Safe Drinking Water Act and amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act. So the big morale impact, of course, is having very few people to carry out all these significant responsibilities under our environmental laws. The second major impact, however, though, came with this prolonged shutdown, a shutdown that was really unjustified from any standpoint. And what happened during that shutdown is because so many what I consider very essential functions were considered inessential, nothing got done. So right now, we know that there were absolutely no safety inspections at chemical factories, oil refiners, power plants, and other industries around the country. The enforcement actions completely stopped, and we know that we're already at a historic low in enforcement and in the reduction of pollutant discharges, historically low compared to any previous administration. And all of that stopped during the shutdown. Furthermore, all Superfund cleanups were stopped unless there was some imminent danger at a site. There's been no air or water monitoring done at critical sites, which included drinking water supply monitoring for toxics in North Carolina, toxic algae monitoring in Florida. And furthermore, all research stopped on the toxicity of chemicals, especially new emerging chemicals like the perfluorinated compounds that are contaminating many drinking water supplies around the country. So enormous damage was done by that 35-day shutdown, and it's going to take them weeks to get back up to speed, especially with the small staff that they have now.
Betsy, there's so much more we could talk about, including some solutions to all of this, but we'll have to save that for another day. Betsy Southerland joining us. She's the former Director of Science and Technology in the Office of Water at the Environmental Protection Agency. Betsy, I've enjoyed this conversation very much, and I thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.